You're watching wrestling. The action spills to the outside and the wrestlers start to get very loosey-goosey in terms of the rules. As the referee goes shrug emoji, let's just see what's going to happen. Let's give them a little bit of rope. No doubt a human probably then gets thrown through a table. Now this could be any promotion in the modern day, and if they were all going to get together and thank somebody for making this possible, you go to ECW. I mean, even when All Elite Wrestling was born, you could feel the influence. Look at somebody like the Cody Rhodes MJF storyline. Cody wasn't allowed to touch Maxwell Jacob Friedman even after he'd been whipped because they were the rules laid out in order for the American Nightmare to get the match. Somewhere Paul Heyman would have been smiling. Of course, ECW itself was also influenced by the likes of Frontier Wrestling over in Japan, which was headed up by the famed Anita in the late 90s, although this train keeps on stretching throughout the industry, because you do not get the WWF Attitude Era as we know it without ECW. You can even go back to the 80s boom in the WWF and say that was inspired by the AWA boom. So this is just how the promotion works. And I guess ECW realized that. They went out there and it left its mark. So, let us go back to the 23rd of August 1985 and ultimately somebody who could be dubbed the first Paul Heyman guy. This is when Paul was still talking his way into shows when he was basically a teenager. Eventually the mid-80s rolled around and he basically decided maybe I should put on my own wrestle party, which he did at the famed Studio 84 nightclub. Heyman wasn't going into this blind though, because not only had he found a way to sit under the learning tree of some proper legendary names, but he also found his first star, the ridiculously huge and yet mad agile Bam Bam Bigelow. As would become a staple of Paul, he promoted the whole show around Bam and basically told you this is the next big thing. And I chose those words on purpose. Heyman was able to get the noise he wanted to because the likes of the Nature Boy Ric Flair turned up to this, and given that it was an event at a popular venue, well, all of a sudden it felt cool. Maybe this Paul Heyman guy was on the up and up. Maybe we should take him a little bit more seriously. He will continue to toil away, which is when we jump to August 4th, 1990, because in a first-of-its-kind war, the already mentioned Anita defeats Tarzan Goto in a no-rope, barbed wire, current blast death match. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? Now, it's not actually the most famous, because that goes to Terry Funk and Anita in 1993, and I tell you, that was the benchmark. And it also told individuals you can do totally nuts stuff with your violence, and you're still going to draw a crowd. I mean, that's what was happening in Frontier, and where all of the success came from. I mean, the audiences kept increasing, and for whatever reason, fans wanted to see humans literally, on some occasions, get torn apart or exploded. I mean, the tape trading scene at the time was desperate to see this, and in many ways, if you could get your hand on a tape like this, you become the belle of the ball. That also included Paul Heyman. So in a very niche corner, FMW was taking over Japan, when I think Paul looked off into the distance and said, what if somebody tried to do the same template in the United States of America? I mean, if nothing else, it was worth a try, which is when we go to September 24th, 1991, which is an odd date, but if you're a hardcore music nerd, you will know this is the day that Nirvana released Nevermind, and it changed how an entire generation saw the world, and basically told everybody else that our color palette is now grey. It is a good window into the wrestling industry though, because the WWF was on the way down. Hulkamania was over. Vince McMahon, as he always wanted to do, was desperate to find the new Hulk Hogan, which was never going to work, and he just kept making his television shows brighter and brighter. I mean, that is what had worked with Hulk, so why don't we do it again? And as for WCW, don't even worry about them. They were so out of touch. They also didn't have a lot of money. What they both forgot to do, though, was look at pulp culture to see what was happening outside of the wrestling bubble and what can we seize upon, because in many ways the answer was Kurt Cobain, and yet the only person interested was Paul Heyman. There was only one problem in the sense that Heyman was in WCW at the time as Paul E. Dangerously, and there he was just a manager. He had no creative options, which is why when we got to 1993 and he was essentially fired, well, he was probably pretty happy. Essentially, promoter Bill Watts had told him, would you stop running around being annoying? Heyman said no. Now the answer was always going to be a brand new promotion, but not WCW and not WWF, because in short, Paul didn't think they were very cool. It meant that he, along with some others, were going to take over a regional promotion known as ECW. And look, they weren't making headline news at the time, and all of a sudden the famed Wrestling Observer decided to feature them very heavily on the 14th of February. The night the line was crossed was the name of the house show, and this ruffled some feathers because, as Dave Meltzer called it at the time, this was one of the best house shows in years. Now look, we are not quite extreme yet, but the whole show was different, including the main event. Now, this won't blow your brain in the modern day, but we're talking about the 90s here, and having something called a three-way dance close the show felt like we were changing the game. Now, of course, it's the very popular triple threat, but that's exactly the point again. It was Paul Heyman who decided to go with this first. He also booked Sabu, Terry Funk, and Shane Douglas in this, and yep, it went to a 1 hour long draw. Now, that kind of felt like an insult to try it in 1994. But at the end, it got a standing ovation. It was just the start of a huge shift that was going to happen, even if the roster was still a story of two halves. It doesn't hold up over time either, because when you look at other shows, they are not as good. But the word was getting around. Maybe if you were a disenfranchised fan, you should go and check out ECW. All of this continued on to the 14th of August as well, because Heyman basically just started booking matches he wanted to see, hence why longtime friends and rivals Terry Funk and Cactus Jack engaged in utter warfare, because they headlined a show known as Hardcore Heaven when the Public Enemy interrupted to beat up Cactus Jack, forcing the enemies to quickly team up. What most remember though, and will be featured in video packages for years to come, is Funk asking a fan for a chair and then tells them to throw it in the ring. Terry was so damn over, the whole building took that as a request, and everybody stood up and threw their seat into the squared circle, and it was one of the coolest visuals ever. It's also pretty scary because Public Enemy are now legitimately being buried by chairs, to the point commentator Joey Styles leaves his position to try and get them to stop. Totally unhinged. Now, I suppose this is as good a time as any to talk about the ECW arena, which is filled with young males wanting to be involved. They also wanted carnage. It meant when new faces walked in, it was a little bit intimidating. It's like that bar down the road that's only frequented by locals. When a new individual comes in looking for a drink, who the flub is that guy and what does he want? What's great about this is the promotion is still called Eastern Championship Wrestling, and I figure that Heyman already had plans to change that. I mean, such a name had its roots in the wrestling of days of old, so come the 27th of August, Paul decides he needs to send a message to those old fuddy-duddies. You don't get what we're doing. Because Shane Douglas wins a tournament to become the NWA champion, which is the same belt that traveled around the world, when Paul Heyman gets in his ear. After you do win, throw it on the floor and talk about how much the NWA sucks. Furthermore, go after Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, and Luthez and tell everyone they suck too. Douglas even tells them to kiss his ass. Now, this was sold like Shane Douglas was killing the NWA, but let's be honest, it was already dead, and that's why Heyman wanted to do this. The reputation and the legacy was still there, but they were never going to be what they once were, so let's use it to fuel a new way of wrestling. It was so transgressive and controversial, a lot of people still see this as the day that ECW was properly born, because nobody else had the balls to do it. Just to be super corny as well, so I will apologize. This was Heyman's Nevermind moment, and yes, I'm talking about the album again, because he just didn't care. He was gonna do what he wanted. By the 28th of August, this was ramping up because 1994 was just that year. It was time for Tommy Dreamer to put himself on the map, and it was a choice because, no joke, before this infamous night, Tommy would get groans from the crowd because he just came across like a goody two-shoes babyface. Even he knew that something needed to change though, and when he replaced Tommy Cairo to face the Sandman, I suppose everybody agreed now was the best time to get it done. So we had a Singapore cane match. Now, what's really mad and forgotten these days is where this came from. It was a shocking international incident that saw an American teenager receive 4 lashes of a cane as punishment for vandalism. So as ever, Heyman was in the news. He decided to use real life for his fantasy, whatever worked. The concept is simple too, to get Tommy Dreamer over as a never say die babyface who has the heart of a lion, not literally. He was also going to take this weapon and throw it into the mainstream, because after losing, Tommy gets ready for war as the Sandman horrifically gives him 10 shots with this thing. Now, you're probably already thinking about Cody Rhodes in 2020, whatever it was. Exactly. The later feud with Raven is likely Dreamer's peak, but it was these fights against the Sandman that got that all going. I mean, look at the Sandman 2, a beer-swilling maniac who walked to the ring to Metallica's Enter Sandman. Yeah, people were going to pay attention to that. Even the hardcore Philadelphia fans are somewhat disturbed by this Singapore caning, because it gets a bit too real and the violence gets a bit too much, and Tommy is quite clearly in some real pain. That was entirely the idea. Woman who accompanied Sandman to the ring helps with this as well, because she's desperate for this to continue. And when we get to number 9, Dreamer actually says, "Thank you, sir. May I have another?" His career instantly changed. it worked. October 1st carries on the madness too because ECW books the match under I Quit rules. It just meant more punishment, although the big talking point wasn't planned. After the referee sticks a microphone in Tommy's face and Dreamer pushes it away because he's not quitting, the cigarette the Sandman was smoking catches him in the eye. Well, he too screams out in legit pain, because that wasn't meant to happen. Dreamer then gets the cane and technically blinds this man, and good grief. Once again, woman has a conniption on the outside because her insane joy goes to genuine concern, and even the referee and the Tommy look at each other like, uh-oh, we don't know what to do. This wasn't on the bingo card, and now we're totally boned. The Sandman is rushed backstage, and look, we see a lot of this. And again, it's 1994, so you never got a glimpse, and even the wrestlers themselves shatter the illusion, because they're concerned for the Sandman too. Commissioner Todd Gordon even shouts at the cameraman, "This ain't meant to be happening, maybe you shouldn't be filming it, get the hell out of here." The Sandman himself also vanishes from public life, and even refuses to go to the bars that he would often frequent. He doesn't even answer his door. On ECW TV, fans are even encouraged to send well wishes to him, even though he was cast as the villain. And look, it's laid on so thick, it works. Everybody thought it was legit. Even me, the way I told you a few minutes ago, I lied. It all comes to light during the retirement ceremony for the Sandman when he just murders Tommy Dreamer at the November to Remember show on November 5th. And while some fans were a little bit annoyed, most were impressed. They were meant to be the hardcore of the hardcore, and even they got worked, even though they would walk around saying, "You can't do it." Incorrect. He did. We now move to April 8, 1995, and given when this was recorded, it's somewhat poignant. Sabu. A man so dangerous he has to be willed to the ring with a muzzle like Hannibal Lecter, Sabu was also obsessed with tables. Most super nerds will tell you it was Randy Savage in Memphis in 1984 who smashed one first, but nobody did more to cement them in the modern wrestling landscape than Sabu. He totally changed the game, so if you've ever chanted "We want tables," you need to thank the guy. And do not forget, this was the mid-90s, and Sabu was not a supergiant. He wasn't massive, he wasn't tall, he didn't have pecs of steel, but he was an enigma, and Heyman spotted this a mile away and marketed him as such. Because he was the homicidal, suicidal, genocidal, death-defying maniac. And while high risk is another solid term, his use of chairs and how he conducted himself was terrifying. Like every single thing he did felt like life or death, because this was a man who sellotyped his torn bicep back together, even though it had fallen out all over the floor. That's true as well, he just carried on with the match. So the nicknames themselves may have been accurate because Sabu was like nobody else, and he even got fired from ECW one day when he double booked himself in Japan, and he took the Japanese date because that one paid more money. Paul even managed to monetize that though, because the three-way dance on this evening was meant to be headlined by Sabu, so Heyman just headed to the ring and begged the fans not to ask for a refund. By the end of his speech, the whole audience was chanting, excuse my French, "Fuck Sabu." I mean, that is Jedi mind tricks to the next level. It's also a massively important thing to note because it's becoming clear Heyman is almost like a cult-like figure, not only to the ECW fan base, but to the wrestlers too. It doesn't matter if Sabu is not going to be there, because Heyman will figure it out. This was surely by design, because Paul was not an idiot. He knew the bigger sharks would always be circling to take away his talent, so what better way to circumvent that than by telling everybody, don't worry, there's always an answer, and it's the brand that is the star. And who does that sound like? WWE. July 1st, 1995, Hardcore Heaven carries on the production line because we do get to the Public Enemy, a tag team who got this hardcore crowd to wave their arms like Joe Hendry in 2025. They defeat the Gangsters, who were composed of Mustafa Saeed and a man called New Jack. Now these two were making their debut, and good grief, it was utter chaos. I mean, the amount of wreckage was out of control, and if fans did not know who they were, well, by the end of it, they absolutely did. Because Jack and Saeed had somewhat of a reputation from Smoky Mountain Wrestling, where they weren't particularly popular. Doesn't matter here, because despite losing, they got over, and really, they too were breaking down barriers, figuratively and literally. The biggest tick was that they followed on the culture of music as they represented the best of hip-hop. They even walked to the ring to the likes of Dr. Dre and Ice Cube, and often those tunes would continue to play as they fought. There it is again, anarchy in the arena. As always, Heyman knew the strengths and weaknesses, and maybe the gangsters were somewhat one-dimensional. Therefore, let's just give them all the bells and whistles, or to use one of Paul's famous terms, you hide one and you extenuate the other. The amount he would get out of some guys for years using this method was beyond impressive, and during this show, it's also a death match between Axel and Ian Rotten. Now look, just repeat everything I said, because it is one of the most grotesque fights you will ever see. I mean, by the end, there is glass sticking out of people's hands, and if you were into your magazines back then, the images were seared into your brain for years. What the hell was this ECW thing? That's exactly how Paul Heyman wanted it. The 19th of September was an important day too, mostly down to two magical words in wrestling: creative freedom. Mick Foley was always going to take advantage of that because he was a genius, so as Cactus Jack, he did the unthinkable. He told Tommy Dreamer to stop killing himself for these fans. The ECW arena doesn't deserve it. Now, this was all off the back of seeing a sign in the crowd that simply said Kane Dewey, which was a reference to Foley's real-life son. So as you now know, this was somebody asking the Sandman to wreck a proper child, and surprise, surprise, Mick took that personally. However, rather than get bitter, he used it though, because no longer would he sacrifice himself in such a barbaric way, because these appalling individuals didn't deserve it. Jack then totally did away with his hardcore act, and given that was the USP of ECW, it was utter genius. You want the fans to turn on you, take away what they love, and make sure you have a very legitimate reason to do it. Foley also takes this further too, as he saw the tribalism for what it was. He started to praise the WWF and WCW, and even begged the latter to let him come home. What an idea. I suppose you can call it sports entertainment versus wrestling, something that AEW also mucked around with in 2022, and all the hits kept on coming, because on the 16th of October, Rey Mysterio versus Psychosis happens in an ECW ring, and the whole world stops. It was a match of the year candidate with a style of wrestling that was going to inspire what we see today. It was also needed because at the same time, New Jack went and got himself fired. After a match with Dances with Dudley, Jack decided he was too stiff, so kicked his ass for real. It was so bad, a message had to be sent to the entire locker room, even more so because Mikey Whipwreck got caught up in the crossfire. Even for Extreme Championship Wrestling, this was too much, which means all of this is a mixed bag. But ultimately, the fans are fascinated by the product, which is not true for the WWF and Vince McMahon. In fact, Vince was so desperate, he hired old school head honcho Bill Watts to run his creative. Watts wanted to go back to the day where faces and heels had to be separated, whereas ECW was letting guys murder each other. I mean, the path to the future of the industry had never been so confused, and it also just reminded the hardcore fans they'd made the right choice by getting on the ECW bandwagon, because now they were getting fast-paced future action wrestling too. It's everything they wanted, even more so because the WWF was still filled with cartoons. December 1995 is also important because, yep, it featured the Tasmaniac. That was Taz's original name, and during this period he was going through a shift. As the likes of MMA were on the rise, why not portray himself as a legitimate threat, while at the same time suplexing people all over the place? I mean, every single one of these would also give the impression he was dropping fools on their heads, and sometimes he was actually just doing that. Heyman gets on board too because he has Taz defeat Koji Nagawa in minutes, and the ending is Koji tapping to the Taz mission chokehold. Taz then told the fans to fuck off, and all of a sudden, we thought he was the rudest dude ever, even more so because he kept going after Sabu. This is when Paul instigated a no-touch policy between the two men, and again, it's par for the course these days, but in the mid-90s, that was a super interesting angle. All of a sudden, the anticipation had to increase, because unless they were given the green light, they would not be allowed to fight. I mean, I guess we'll just have to part with our hard-earned cash and watch it on pay-per-view. Taz starts to find the simple things in his presentation too, such as wearing a towel on his head, and let's get back to it, the tap-out. Seeing an opponent scream in pain and smash the mat somehow made it feel worse. I mean, maybe it was just a better way to convey agony to the audience. ECW would take that all the way as well, because now you could have a guy raise their hand in the air as if they were going to tap, but now you could treat it as a near fall. Will they, won't they, etc. And think of all the classic matches we have seen since then that have borrowed this in order to give you that sort of emotion. I mean, quite frankly, it's everywhere. Just to make Extreme Championship Wrestling the continued little engine that could too, Taz is the guy doing graphic design for the promotion, and a lot of those were white on black designs to keep costs down. And I'll give you a second, what sort of logo does that remind you of? So if somebody wants to turn up at Taz's house and give him a massive check one day, well, it would be massively deserved. We now jump forward to the August 14th, 1996, because ECW remains the hippest company there is. The issue is the future of the business is shaky at best, and by this time Heyman has discovered and brought in another talent by the name of Chris Jericho. But soon he's out the door to WCW on August 3rd. This was always going to be the forever issue with ECW too. You find the next big thing, then you see them leave for more money. The reason the 14th is so important though is because the Wrestling Observer's Dave Meltzer reports that the syndicated TV channel in New York that airs ECW has pulled the plug because the product is too graphic. This is not good. Because of course the overall goal is a proper TV deal that will allow them to be aired nationally, and to break it right down, there was too much blood. It means the first time ECW has to deal with a word they do not want to hear, compromise. It is somewhat unfair because if you were watching at the time, ECW was more than just blood and guts. But at the same time, there is an aspect the fans still wanted. They'd almost been trained that way, so regardless, if Heyman felt the need to water it down, the audience will see it and probably get pissed off. And arguably, this is the first sign that the company is never actually going to be properly sustainable, or at least as an alternative. We then get to the 23rd of November, and the mass transit incident happened. This was so bad it's been ingrained into wrestling lore, and yeah, it was not good. An untrained underage wrestler called Eric Koulas had somehow talked his way onto an ECW show and found himself up against New Jack. That wasn't even the first plan. He was gonna be in a pre-show gimmick fight, when instead he teams with Devon Dudley to take on the gangsters, and apparently went up to New Jack and said, "Hey, I can do all of these moves." You can imagine how New Jack reacted to that, so man, did he just blend this guy. What's even worse is that Koulas asked New Jack to blade him because he'd never done it before. I'm sure you can figure out the rest. The amount of blood spilled was just horrendous, and Eric's father, who is in the crowd, is begging medics to stop the whole thing. New Jack, in his wisdom, then grabs a microphone and shouts, "I don't care if this Mother Hubbard dies." Oh no. Networks and pay-per-view providers are so appalled that ECW's first major event is put on hold and almost cancelled completely. Request TV has to be talked back into the fold thanks to Paul Heyman's negotiation skills. And really, if you want to sum it up, it couldn't have gone any worse. It does mean that Barely Legal is delayed until April 1997, and yeah, there's an ominous feeling in the air due to all of the above, and not everything lands as expected. Sabu versus Taz almost has too much expectation, so the critical fan base feels somewhat let down, whereas RVD versus Lance Storm is good, but again, it doesn't quite hit right. Of course, technical difficulties also plague the show, which always happens on your first go-around, but this is the ECW audience and they're not that forgiving. They paid their money, and that's that. If you don't work, you're gonna be yelled at. The good news for ECW is that they now have Terry Funk, and it is almost impossible to explain how important he was to multiple generations of wrestling. But on this night, he went and did it again. Because next to his own father's grave, he cuts an all-time promo promising that he's gonna go round one more time, and he's gonna do it in his dad's honor. Paul Heyman is also on hand for another of his rah-rah speeches, but there is nobody better than that. And he even drops the famous, "Fuck you, you're wrong, fuck you, we were right" line. He, the locker room, and the fans all believe in this still, because there was gonna be no blinking. Funk also does the babyface thing, and he wins a three-way dance against Stevie Richards and the Sandman, which actually not only earns him a title shot against Raven, but because this was ECW, that match was going to happen later on in the show in the main event. That, of course, is no good for Terry, who is just bleeding buckets like it's going out of fashion, right down to the medical team desperately trying to get him to stop. Tommy Dreamer then uses this to heat up his rivalry with Raven as he interferes to help Funk win, but the true joy is how Terry is presented here. He is the living legend under the ECW banner, and not one single human being watching thinks he doesn't deserve it. We were finally going to give him his flowers. It also shows that ECW can actually do loveliness too, because that's exactly what it is. And it also shows that the promotion is way more than just blood and guts and bones and death, because if you're going to use another word, well, it's pretty damn sentimental. It almost feels as if Heyman is rewarding loyalty to both himself and to the business overall, and the pay-per-view itself gets around 55,000 buys, And that's enough to make the monthly big show something ECW can heavily invest in. And let's face it, they needed that if they wanted to be like for like with WCW and WWF. That was another problem. They just did not have the same resources. Come 1997, the creativity is still there, although some will tell you this is when the promotion peaked. April 13th then shows another side of this as Paul Heyman books a match in conjunction with Michinoku Pro. Ran Hamada, the Great Sasuke, and Masato Yakakushi defeat Taka Michinoku, Dick Togo, and Terry Boy. The 17-minute flippy-dippy-doo-dah-a-thon is nothing like a Western audience had seen before, unless you were the king of the tape traders. Surprise, surprise, it's met with another standing ovation. It was a feather in Paul's cap because it was a big middle finger to the so-called big leagues. You can continue to take our talent, but we'll just find more, and we'll book it in a way that feels like we're actually living in 2025. That doesn't mean the needle hadn't have shifted, because the routine of ECW doing something good and then it magically getting used elsewhere is now obvious. You could even describe the promotion as a research lab before the wealthier operations fly in. And you know the deal, wrestlers are always going to follow the money. I mean, they have to. Somewhat ironically, Heyman is actually working with the WWF to help with ideas, while also getting some cash to filter back into the ECW brand, and that has been debated for years. Did it make these talent jumps even easier? Even though Vince McMahon was right in his assumption. ECW was never going to put a dent in their overall business at all. It was better to have them as a smaller ally, because all the hate went towards World Championship Wrestling instead. June 7th is more proof that we're nowhere near done, because ECW ensured we're getting good guy payoffs. The feud between Tommy Dreamer and Raven finally gets to its first resolution, and to say that Tommy finally pinned Raven is no exaggeration, because this was extended for months and months and months and months and months. I mean, I think some fans truly believed that Dreamer was never going to get it done. The backstory was insane too, because years ago they had both attended a summer camp in their younger days, where Tommy was the jock, and obviously Raven was the outcast grunge guy. Lula McGillicuddy was involved too, where she got called fat, and now she was the pin-up model, whereas Raven was the damn world champion. They made it. Of course, the twist was that Raven, who was once the babyface from a, well, that's sad point of view, was now the proper heel, right down to brainwashing the Sandman's wife Laurie and her young son to join his group. I mean, that was really flubbed up stuff at times. Tyler, the son, even talked about his real dad being drunk all the time, as Raven sat right there watching. A year before, he'd also been involved in the very controversial crucifix angle, which caused the watching on Kurt Angle to swear blind that pro wrestling wasn't for him. What's always lost in that too is the ECW audience didn't like it either. They made their voices heard to the point ECW even came out and said sorry. Given that we did have this kind of backstory though, and a narrative that spanned decades, many have said that it's super interesting that the Kane versus Undertaker thing also kicked off soon after this one. And look, Raven vs. Dreamer isn't the model of what you would do in pro wrestling. It is seen as very ambitious. Certain parts do stretch the suspension of disbelief. To compare it to somebody today, MJF would probably come right up, because here are some harrowing moments from my path that are going to shape my future. Tommy winning still counts as a happy ending though, which is always what you need in pro wrestling. Then again, it was a little bit forced. Raven was going to WCW. We now move to May 3rd, 1998, because there's something else to talk about. WrestlePalooza. Well, this was quite bad. It's important to note that the WWF is now the Attitude Era, so it has the cool factor, which begs the question why we had Shane Douglas cutting the most ridiculous promo on Dick Flair. And yes, you heard that right, he called him Dick. There's also certain parts of the audience who didn't get Douglas still being the ECW champion, because the truth was, by 1998 he was struggling with injury, and he wasn't the guy he once was. It sort of felt like somebody holding on, which is exactly what ECW fans didn't like about the other organizations. When your time is up, we want new blood. Heyman has also decided Taz has got to be the guy to take the belt from Shane, which adds 9 months to the waiting list, whereas RVD and the TV title become the focus of the show. It also ties into the fact that Heyman is expanding out of the Northeast to have events in Georgia, Louisiana, Ohio, and Alabama, and it does ring true. These fans, although captivated by what they've read, aren't ready to support it live in droves. The audiences aren't great. And as for Douglas, well, after the fact, he actually gets called out for his promo, where he says that Ric Flair and Eric Bischoff kiss each other's asses, when it had become very clear that that relationship was most definitely based on hate. Thankfully, it is Taz who interrupts, and the fans are smitten with him at this stage, saying he saved the segment maybe a little bit too much, but it's also not that far off. Shane eventually goes on to defeat Al Snow with his mannequin head, and yeah, you can see the pain in Douglas's eyes, I guess he had given too much and he needed some time off. The issue was wrestlers back then just weren't going to ask for it, and it meant the foundations of the match were just punch, kick, punch, kick, punch, kick due to his limitations. And here it comes again. This audience had decided that's what The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin did. How dare you do that in ECW too? Now, you really do need to appreciate the gutsy performance by Shane, but when you are doing it in front of the most critical audience possibly in the industry, you get less leeway. Hence why the ECW locker room empties to celebrate his win. Even more eyebrows get raised. Let's just use the words they did at the time. For the first time, Extreme Championship Wrestling felt just a little bit fake. May 25th proves to be another issue, as by then, good grief, unless you were there for it live, the jump in WWF business had to be seen to be believed, and it was all revolving around one man, Stone Cold Steve Austin. And on this night, Austin had Vince McMahon arrested and led away in handcuffs, and the response from the crowd is deafening. Heyman is rumored to be massively frustrated because, yeah, as far as he's concerned, this is the Sandman reworked for the World Wrestling Federation, and sure, I mean, there's the beer-swilling antics, the not giving a damn, the swearing, just to kick Paul even more. He saw this version of Steve Austin find his feet during his short stay in ECW. I mean, do not forget that Heyman himself had first endorsed Steve all the way back in 1991 when they were in the Dangerous Alliance, and now somebody else was monetizing it. And beyond anything else, ECW needed money. It did mean that Paul Heyman was right about his vision though. Wrestling did need to be a little bit darker, grittier, and by mid-1998, this concept has exploded on WWE television. I mean, they were the new movement before the movement became the movement. The result also meant that the ECW appeal was dwindling because now you could see their style on a bigger stage with better production values. We fans can be a fickle bunch. August 2nd brings us Heatwave, and look at this shift. You could call it as the best bell-to-bell pay-per-view of the year. Because Just Incredible comes out as a mega heel when he wrecks Jerry Lynn, whereas Chris Candido is just the cockiest man on the planet as he defeats Lance Storm. Taz and Bam Bam Bigelow also have the best Falls Count Anywhere match, and the ECW FMW crossover is cool. RVD and Sabu defeat Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki. And then there's the main event. It sees the Sandman and Spike Dudley take on Big Dick Dudley, Bubba Ray and Devon. I suppose you could call this an insane bonanza. It's why it was able to close the show, because they go totally nuts in order to send the crowd home happy. It also ties into Heyman deciding to move away from the long, sometimes drawn-out main event world title matches, which surely was inspired by a Japanese style of pro wrestling. Instead, he decides to rely on things like Mike Awesome versus Tanaka. There's a reason people still talk about those wars today. They were totally insane, even now. And if somebody told you the stip there was to murder the other guy, you'd totally believe it. And I won't tell you where Orson ends up, you already know, but the initials are WCW. It has ever meant Heyman has to shuffle the deck, which he does again on March 21st, 1999, when Rob Van Dam defends his title against Jerry Lynn at Living Dangerously in a match that nearly every single wrestler working today will tell you had an effect on their career, even if they don't realize it. I mean, the engine of the thing is basically 80% of what you will see on the indie scene today, because you have back and forth action, counters, reversals, and near falls that make you make noise. Somebody once described it as trying to get the crowd to buy into the quality of the fiction as opposed to the fiction itself. And yeah, that's beautifully and wonderfully put. In short, sometimes you can just enjoy the crazy things that these guys are working together to do. If you would like a modern word, I'll give it to you. It's a banger. It's also the night where Taz and Shay Douglas finally put their beef to bed, and look, it is too long. But Mr. Orange is the champion at this stage, and he successfully defends it. It was basically telling you this program is done. Taz is the guy, and of course he soon too would leave for the World Wrestling Federation. You see the pattern. April 11th, 1999 is an incredibly interesting date to look back on, because we actually go to WCW Spring Stampede pay-per-view. I think we can all see where hardcore wrestling was born, at least how we know it, and it was popularized in the West thanks to ECW. Although on this show, Eric Bischoff presents Bam Bam Bigelow versus Hack, the former Sandman, in a hardcore battle. Somewhere Paul Heyman must have lost his mind. Of course, both by this stage had left for World Championship Wrestling, and you should go and watch this now and compare the different versions of the Sandman. I don't begrudge him this at all, of course I don't, but he is in way better aesthetic shape in the so-called big leagues, and really that makes all the sense in the world. Sandman's connection with the ECW audience was so strong, nothing else matters, but the rules change when the company changes, and he knew that. I suppose it was the right play. Around the same time, Tommy Dreamer is also linked with WCW, but has long stated he turned it down due to loyalty. According to Dreamer, Paul Heyman cried when he even mentioned it, followed by some iconic words, "You can't do this." ECW was a world unto itself. It does feel like the right time to get into the long-standing story about ECW, which was the bouncing of checks. Many of the roster to this day will speak about it being the main reason they did have to leave, including Mike Awesome. In April 2000, he did go to WCW just because he needed to pay his bills. The constant promises had finally dwindled out, and it was why Tommy Dreamer was in a difficult position, because for all intents and purposes, he was the business partner of Paul Heyman. Because Dreamer's own money was invested into the company, as was some of his family's, and Dreamer would be the guy to set up investor meetings, hoping to get some extra cash injected into the business. The reason nobody ever bit? Well, according to the Wrestling Observer, it's because Paul Heyman couldn't produce adequate financial records. This then could lead into a story you may have heard about because it has done the rounds, and that is Tommy Dreamer being so despondent with Paul Heyman that in an interview he spoke about the fact he once considered assassinating the man. Now whether that's true or just wrestler talk we don't know, but still, that is a wild thing to even think about, let alone share with the press. It was fueled forward by the fact that at the time Heyman joined WWE as a color commentator, and I suppose deep down Tommy felt totally betrayed. It then got worse because Paul told Dreamer there was going to be a spot for him at WrestleMania 17, and that never appeared, and these feelings were dragged further with the stories from Chris Candido and Tammy Sitch. They had been struggling financially too, so left ECW, and the word was they never received the travel expenses they charged their own credit cards, and no, that's not good. We now go back to 1999 on November 7th because Taz is the next major star to go. His last match is to lose to RVD at November to Remember, and this time it does get out, causing the fans to do the biggest of no-nos. Taz is greeted by 3 words, "You sold out." Years later, Taz, through tears by the way, tells his story and how he couldn't actually go through with any of this without Paul Heyman's blessing. That's how all in this roster was. Taz would go on to explain he just wanted 3 things from his wrestling career before he started. 1, to make enough money to support him and his family. 2, the validation of holding a title anywhere. And 3, being a true New Yorker, just wanted to perform at Madison Square Garden. Now the fact for a while Taz maybe believed he could do that in ECW speaks volumes, or maybe deep down he always knew that if he was going to achieve that last one, he would have to go to the WWF. At that time, the Garden and the World Wrestling Federation were like best friends. Now there is a sort of AEW parallel here, because superstars ran from the WWF when it bottomed out, and they felt compelled to go back once the Attitude Era blew up. I mean, we saw the same kind of thing in 2022 when Paul Levesque took over operations. The mood most definitely shifted. July 18th brings ECW Heatwave, and look, Paul Heyman was confident of getting a proper national TV deal in mid-1999, and Taz does successfully defend his world title against Tajiri. Fans love this guy too. He just kicks fools as hard as he can, and if nothing else, he is another new guy, and that's somebody to be excited about. It is RVD and Jerry Lynn versus Lance Storm and Just Incredible in the main event that gets everybody going nuts though. I mean, it's pretty damn great, and it's another one. You can stick it in 2025 and it will be fine. The other talking point wasn't as kosher as the Dudley Boys decided to cut a promo before their tag team title loss to Spike and Balls Mahoney. For some reason, they tell a mother in the front row, and excuse my language, that she taught her daughter to, well, suck someone's special area. And this woman is so appalled, she spits in Bubba's face. The homophobia and sexual assault references are also just not cool, and certainly not what wrestling wants to be associated with. The reason it does come up a lot though is because a lot of people argue it's the last bastion of real quote-unquote heat. Because people are quite properly mad with what has been said beforehand, but when the bell rings, I mean the match is okay at best, but the fans calm down, they don't want to riot, they kind of just get on with the thing. So whatever the Dudleys had done beforehand, but it didn't actually translate to the fight itself. In fact, the fans mostly just want flaming tables. And the desire for wood is not new in 2025, and it is important to note this spot where the Dudleys sent Balls and Spike through some fire. WWE then went and did the same thing at WrestleMania 22. Because of course. Now at the time, the network TNN that Paul Heyman is talking with is not on board, mostly because they just think that ECW is too violent, and maybe ECW could shift gears. From a creative point, this probably wouldn't have been the worst idea ever because they can't compete, and the exposure and the money just isn't there. Paul Heyman realizes this, so he does go to TNN, who once again tell him to tone it back. and instead, well, he doubles down, and by this point they do have a deal. It all comes to a head on the 27th of August 1999 because ECW finally airs on the network, and while the deal is not good and eventually will become a detriment to the company, Paul Heyman totally believes this is the way to achieve the potential he dreams of. Sort of. Parent company Viacom still has it in the deal that any super future gross revenues would mostly go to them, so this really is Heyman betting himself entirely. They're gonna have to make loads of cash just to stay afloat. And even the name of the damn thing is ECW on TNN, which doesn't really scream, oh my gosh, you should watch this. And Heyman's first decision is to air a highlight package in order to catch up new fans. That is not what TNN wanted, and they fall out instantly. And when Heyman asks for ECW adverts to run on other programs, TNN says no. Instead, they tell Paul Heyman once again that he does have to tone things down. So what does he do? He created a stable called The Network, led by Don Callis, who would just sit on commentary and bury TNN. I mean, how insane is that? There's even a conspiracy theory that goes around that TNN was just waiting for the WWF to be free. And while the ECW ratings are not terrible, well, it's not where you wanted to be in 1999, especially when wrestling was booming. It still somehow lasts for over a year, and then yes, ECW does get canned before TNN starts to air Monday Night Raw, so maybe those thoughts weren't so crazy after all. By this point, Heyman has started to expand his operation though, so he needs this money in order to survive, but there's now no home for Extreme Championship Wrestling on television. The WWF's former home, the USA Network, is not interested at all, and Turner was never going to give a damn. At this point, they were struggling so much with WCW that executives were chatting going, how the hell do we cancel wrestling altogether? There's also the whole curse of the wrestling fans can't afford anything, so why bother to advertise? And let's face it too, it's only really with the new explosion over the last few years as I'm talking to you, when that mindset has finally changed. Before it's totally gone, the strains of ECW are clear as well, as summed up by SummerSlam on April 22nd, 2000. The world title scene was just nuts, because a few weeks before this, Heyman used his ties with the WWF to get Taz back to beat Mike Awesome for the belt, because Awesome had signed with WCW when he was still the champion. For some reason, Paul felt like Taz should return to sort that out. In many ways, it was the original Forbidden Door. Tommy Dreamer eventually defeats Taz here when Just Incredible beats Dreamer minutes later thanks to Francine, who of course turns on Taz. And yes, all of that sounds very convoluted. I mean, desperate is unfair, but it does feel like Paul Heyman is searching rather than sticking to a well thought out plan. I suppose you could say he's worried he knows there's not much time left, so whatever we got to do to stoke the fires is what we'll do. It was a little bit of an error though, because the ECW crowd also decided to give Justin a tough time, because they felt like his push to the main event scene was too fast. It's a story we've heard before, but it's the last thing that Extreme Championship Wrestling needed. They were trying to recapture the feeling, not make the disconnect feel deeper. Steve Corino is next, and he wins the title on November 5th, and it's just the same deal. Corino has the chops, of course, but all of this felt like it was done in fast forward. Steve even defeats Dusty Rhodes at this pay-per-view, and after a feud with Tajiri, there is this chat that Corino relies way too much on Cheap Heat for a reaction, and given some of the things that do come out of his mouth, yeah, maybe. But this time, looking back, we can call it the twilight area of ECW, which is what makes the emerging Rhino even more interesting. This man blew up as much as anybody could. I mean, he was a ridiculously sized wrestler who looks like he's just a wall of a man. Rhino also feels frightening because he is totally stripped back in the best possible way. He's not hard to figure out, he's just gonna kill you. Now, I suppose you could call him a version of Goldberg who swears, but even in the year 2000, he is able to get his variation of the spear over. And of course, you can see what the conversation was at the time. After years of being the creator, all of a sudden Paul Heyman is accused of borrowing and not necessarily improving. I mean, it's not as black and white as that, but again, that's what was being said on message boards around the world. January 13th, 2001 will always be the saddest day for those who stood by the company because, yep, it's the last true ECW show, and I'm not sure Heyman was totally convinced by that. Because we don't get the last hurrah that even WCW Nitro would have in a few months. I mean, it doesn't even take place in the ECW arena, as Paul continually looks for funding. He thinks he can fix it. Instead, it happens in Arkansas of all places. You can go and see the roster. There's certainly talent there, but few who were synonymous with the brand. Instead, the card is basically filled with indie workers, so thank goodness they're now back in the fold. Sandman wins in the main event. I mean, the actors faded by 2001, but still, we all needed that. The only other real banger of note was Tajiri vs. Super Crazy, and less than 2 months later on March 5th, ECW files for bankruptcy. Heyman at the same time debuts on Raw as their brand new color commentator, and soon after this, he stood alongside a lot of his past teammates as the invasion angle kicks off. I mean, we all know how that's gonna go. Not good. Paul gets the biggest of all reprieves when he's actually given the keys to SmackDown in 2002 and 2003, and you can still see the joy that brought fans today. At the time, the WWE was feeling a little bit lost, but it was Heyman who figured out how to breathe life back into the product. Of course, that meant he was stopped before long. We can't have the ECW guy outdoing our long-standing riot. It really does result in some proper coming and going for Paul Heyman, who falls out with the McMahons constantly, until he's eventually brought back for the ECW rebrand in 2006. Now that is fantastic on paper, but Heyman soon realizes that this new version of ECW is not what he wants, and Vince McMahon is basically recreating it in his image. After a huge blowout regarding match finishes and who we should push, Heyman is gone again, this time, as everybody believed, for good, until he came back in 2012. This was all thanks to Brock Lesnar, his former rookie, who also found himself back in the WWE fold. And after Brock tried to do some promos himself, everybody decides better of it. And what's the easiest fix? Let's just bring back Paul Heyman and have him on screen as a manager. You never say never. Over time, of course, Heyman even gets back on the creative team, and we all know the Roman Reigns story. And today, and as of right now, this man is as integral to the backroom team as anybody today. And just go and look at the amount of new talent who credit Paul with helping their careers. It's the corniest thing I'll ever say, but it is true. He's essentially the wise man. He can fix your sports entertainment problem. I would say the so-called cinema era is directly rooted to him too. And as for ECW, well, it faded away rather than burnt out, which is a shame in one sense, because you have to figure that if Heyman knew he was going to go down, he would do it in a blaze of glory. That is rarely the case in wrestling because you don't get to choose, but the legacy remains, and it will do for the rest of our times, because even 2 decades removed from the death of ECW, it is still considered a figurehead of how we got to where we are now. We always use the term change the game all of the time, but this one feels more than appropriate, because Paul Heyman did actually do what he set out to do. His fingerprints are all over the industry and they're never going to go away. Of course, it was meant to be ECW that took him there, but instead it's going to be a different 3 letters we do associate with it. What's to be sure, let's wrap this up with a dumb headline: there will never be another promotion like it. Now, of course, my friends, I'm sure you have ECW memories, so share them in the comments below. Like the video, share the video, and subscribe. Click the video on the screen for another timeline videos where hopefully you can learn a lot about wrestling. Otherwise, take care. I'll see you soon.